Hi everyone. So, do you love watercoloring but you don't know how to draw and you feel a little bit stuck? Well, today I am going to show you how you can turn a digital stamp or any line art into a traceable that you can then watercolor. So, first things first, let's get our paper. So, I have a block of Arches cold press paper here, and then I have my line art that you can purchase as a digital stamp in my Etsy shop. This is what that page looks like, and the link is in the description below. We are going to take a graphite pencil. So I'm using a 9B graph wood pencil by Karen Dosh. I think that's how you pronounce it. And I am just going to flip over our image, and then I'm just going to go over the whole back with the edge of this graphite pencil. Now, you can also use a plain number 2 pencil, like just any pencil that you have in your household sitting around. It will work fine. I'm using the 9B here because it's a very soft lead and it's going to be easier. The lead will be easier to transfer, but number 2 is soft enough. It'll work fine if that's what you have. Okay, so now I have traced over or filled in the background. Now I'm going to put it on my watercolor paper. So this is Arches cold press paper, and I'm going to just tape it down with a strong painter's tape here. I'm going to do it on a diagonal, and I'll show you why in a second. And I'm just going to take my regular pencil. This is just an H pencil. This is the pencil I typically use when doing watercolor sketches. But again, your number 2 household pencil will work just fine here. There's no real need to switch them up. I just did because it's what I'm used to. And now I'm just going to trace over all of the lines in the digital stamp or the line art. And then once I have everything filled in, or I think I have everything filled in, I'll peel back the corner of the tape, take a look, see if I've missed any lines. It looks like I have missed a couple of small lines, so I'm just going to put it right back in place. And by keeping that lower piece of tape in the lower right attached, this way the picture won't move, so it'll be easy to figure out where you need to add any lines you may have missed. And just going to look back and forth a couple times. And now I'm pretty sure that I have it, and I can remove the tape, and now we can move into coloring our little pumpkin here. So the colors that I'm using are on the left side or the right side of the screen, and they are all Daniel Smith watercolor. So the first step, I'm going to add a light wash to the sections of the pumpkins with that yellow. And then I'm going to take the cadmium orange, and just for a little wet on wet technique, I'm going to bleed it into the top and bottom of the little pumpkin sections. I'm leaving a little bit of white space in between each ridge to make sure that the sections don't bleed into one another. And then I'm going to take some of that burnt sienna and just add a tiny, tiny bit to the top and bottoms of the ridges. Now we're going to do that same technique with the other little ridges of the pumpkin, leaving a little bit of white space in between, and just gonna finish that off with our last sections. And if you want, you can go a little bit deeper on the yellow shade here if you want. And then I'm gonna do the same thing, bleeding in the cadmium orange on the top and bottom, and maybe a little bit along the edge. And then we'll go ahead and take I'm still using the cadmium orange here, and then the burnt sienna to just add in a tiny, tiny little bit of color along the top and bottom of the ridges of the pumpkin. And now we're just going to leave it alone for a little bit and let this first layer dry. And the thing with watercolor is the first layer, it always looks like a hot mess. The second layer, it'll start getting a little bit crisper and more into focus. And then when you add on your final touches with your third or your fourth layer, or however many layers as you want, that's when it will really start to sharpen up and come into focus. All right, so I'm just gonna color in the little pumpkin on our pumpkin spice coffee, and then we're gonna add some of that burnt sienna to the little cinnamon sticks that are in the lower right hand corner here. It's a really, really light wash there. So I got a little bit of a little bit more paint, and I'm just gonna add in the coloring on the cinnamon sticks. And then we can move on to the flesh of the donuts, or the cakey part of the donut. I'm using just some yellow ochre here, a really light wash. Probably have a little bit too much water on the brush there, but it's okay. It'll dry, and then we can add some more color to it. Then I'm going to take some of the burnt umber and just fill in the little donut hole on the top, and then just bleed a little bit of that burnt umber into the yellow ochre we just added, just on the ridge, like right underneath the frosting, and let it bleed in. And this is a real tiny area, or at least it is for the size that I printed my pumpkin. With the digital stamp, you can make it any size that you want. And here, my pumpkin, I am using a 7.5 by 7.5 square paper, so that'll give you a sense of how big the pumpkin is. Okay, so now we're going to start adding some leaves, and I have added some additional colors to my palette for this. Those colors are in the lower right hand corner. And for the greens, what I do is I'll take my sap green, and that'll be my base green layer, or my base green, and then I will mix it with the carbazole violet if I want a nice olive or hunter green color. That's the color that we're using for the stem here. When you're drawing the stem, leave a little strip of white down the center so that we can turn it into a highlight later. And then for my green, if I want my green to be more of a blue green, then I will add in the Prussian blue to my green. And sometimes I'll even mix in a little bit of purple with the green as well to get like a really, really deep hunter shade. So that's kind of how I work with my greens. I use the sap green as the base, and then depending on how deep and dark I want it to be, I'll mix it in either violet or a pretty blue shade. Okay. So now I'm going to take some of that sepia that I have on my palette and just bleed that into the edges of the leaves, and then we'll fill in this little stem also with the sepia. And I find that adding the brown here, like in a wet on wet technique, it just gives it a really, really nice earthy look. Then we'll do the little cinnamon stick on the pumpkin. I'm using the burnt sienna mix that I have there. And then we're going to use that olive green shade as well that I used by mixing the sap green and the carbazole purple. Okay, so now let's fill in the rest of the leaves. So for the leaves, I wanted there to be some yellow leaves, some golden leaves, some reddish leaves, and then our green leaves. So I'm just going to add a first layer just in the pattern of how I want the leaves to appear in those different colors. So I thought it would be nice to have a little golden leaf peeking out from the cinnamon stick, a little brown leaf peeking out from the edge of the pumpkin. When you're choosing the colors, you want to make sure there's enough contrast in between the different objects. So like you wouldn't put an orange leaf right next to the pumpkin because you'd have orange and orange. It'd be hard to tell the difference. So that's why around the pumpkin we have browns, we have greens, we have yellows, and we have some golds there as well, just so that all the leaves can stand out. And then we have the whole rainbow of fall colors in our little leaves that our pumpkin and our donuts and coffee are sitting on. Okay, and then we're going to make a nice dark brown leaf right in the center there, and I'm using the burnt umber for that. Now I think the donuts are dry enough, that first layer, that we can start adding a little bit of detail there. So I'm just going to fill in where the shadows should be. So the donut holes I filled in with the sepia, and then like right around the edges of the cakey part of the donut and under the frosting, I'm going to add some of that darker color, and then I'm just blending it out with clear water using a small brush. So I switched to a smaller brush here. I think this one is a 2, just because it was a really tiny area, and it just made me feel more comfortable having a small brush here. Typically, as you go through your layers in watercoloring, your brushes will get smaller and your paint will get thicker. So that's one principle to keep in mind, that when you start with like really, really light color and a big brush. And then as you work your way through the layers, your paint will get thicker, a thicker consistency, and your paint brushes will get smaller. And that's what the layering of those techniques is what's going to allow your picture to come into nice sharp focus by the end. For the frosting, in the Copic colored version, we had like a golden frosting that looked really, really pumpkin spicy. And I thought, let's have a white frosting here. So that's why I used the neutral tint, which is a purplish black. And then I just, I didn't water it down. I just pulled out the color with clear water so that then it looks more like gray, more like, shading on white. So black it's interesting, but if you're trying to make white, you use black paint. It's just the way that you use it. All right. So for the frosting, I'm going to have the edges of the frosting dark and then make sure that I keep a nice light area in the center. That's going to help the frosting look shiny. And it's also going to help give the appearance of dimension and make it look like it's a rounded object. And I'm just going over with the neutral tint now under the layer of frosting and then under the little cakey part of the donut. And what's going to make the frosting appear really light is just going to be the contrast between the edges of the frosting with the center part. So I'm trying to be careful to leave as much white space as I can on the actual donut frosting. And now we can move on to our coffee cup. So the lid, I thought it would be like nice to have a nice fall brown here. So I'm just using the sepia and I'm just going to add it around the edges of the first little rim of the coffee and then pull it out with some clear water. So I added the paint, took a different paintbrush, very small, just clear water, and just pull the color out, leaving a little bit of white space in between the different layers on the coffee lid there. That's just going to help it to look dimensional. And then we have the little cap at the very top. And then I am going to use this is cobalt turquoise, and we're just going to use that for the little paper holder that's around our coffee mug. And then I'll take the Prussian blue and just add it to the edges just to deepen up the color a little bit. And just so that you know, I have sped this video up by 2 times, so I am not painting this fast, but I just thought it would just be too long of a video if I just kept it in real time. So it is sped up just twice. So I'm going twice as fast here as I am in real life. So this painting probably took me about 1 hour and 20 minutes to do, and this video is going to be about 30 minutes long. Just to give you a sense of how long it takes. I find that when I'm doing paintings that I start to just tune out once I get to about the 45 minute mark and I just want to be done with it. And with watercolor, sometimes it's hard to finish a painting in that time. So if I weren't pressed for time, if I weren't trying to get this video out, I might have stepped away from the painting after I got to this part of adding the second layer, and then came back to it maybe a few hours later or the next day to add in the final details to it. So that's just something to keep in mind, that if you find that you're impatient like me with watercolor, sometimes you can just break the different layers into different phases and come back to them over time. But once you do start one layer, you are kind of committed to it, so you have to finish that layer before moving on. Okay, so getting back to the pumpkin. So now I'm going to use some of the red mixed with the burnt sienna, and that's what we're going to use for our to start deepening up the edges of the pumpkin, like the little ridges there. So I just add a strip of color, and then I'm going to take my clean brush with just water on it and pull the color out. So I'm kind of switching back and forth. I'm applying the color with, I think this is a number 4 size brush, and then I pull it out with, I think I have a smaller brush at 2. Sometimes I might reach for my bigger brush. And again, there's no, magic here. It's just what you feel comfortable with. Now to brighten up That center ridge of the pumpkin, I just added some of the yellow to the center there, and you see right away it kind of pops and it looks like it's glowing a little bit. So that's one fun thing I like to do with watercolor is just if I'm not crazy about the tone of something, you can just add a little glaze with a color that will work. And there, the yellow I think worked really, really well. Now I'm doing a little bit of a dry brush technique on this little ridge here just to add some texture to the pumpkin so it looks like those little ridges and imperfections that you see in the pumpkin flesh. And all I mean by dry brush is that as I'm applying the paint, you'll see it skip in some areas, and that's when my brush is getting too dry where there's not enough water on it. So that's what helps you get that texture of that like rough look. So see, it's like happening right now with that little ridge there. And then we'll pull out the color in that section so that the lines aren't so harsh there. And then I'm just going to keep moving around the ridges of the pumpkin with that same method of applying the color to the very edge and then just pulling it out with some clear water on another brush. You can use the same brush, but then what would happen is you'll have to clean off your brush every single time you want to go back, and you can end up wasting paint, wasting time, and it just takes longer that way. So that's why I kind of use this tag team method of having one brush with my paint and then one brush with my clear water on it. Okay, so to darken up the little shadows here, I'm using some of that red mixed with brown. So this is the fun part. When we get into this layer, we can start mixing the colors that we've already used on other layers together just to get some variety of color and shades, make it look interesting. And I'm just going to keep moving around the pumpkin, working piece by piece, just with a wet on dry technique here for the second layer. Now we can move on to our cinnamon stick. So this was probably the part of the image that was most difficult to me. I had a hard time getting it into a sharp focus, but it doesn't matter. At the end of it, it was just a really, really small little area to work in. But I'm just adding a thicker layer of some burnt sienna here to just finish off the cinnamon sticks. Trying to leave some of that first layer showing through just so that we have a variety of color and it looks like it's a little bit bright. Now we can move on to our leaves. So for each leaf, I'm just going to use a thicker consistency of the color we originally used and maybe make it just one shade darker by mixing it with the next darkest shade in the palette that I have. So like for the gold, for the yellow ochre, if I want it to be darker, I'll mix some of the brown in with it, some of the sepia or some of the burnt sienna. That'll help it to appear a little bit darker. And I wanted those little red leaves to be really vibrant, so I'm using mostly red there. And then I'm just going to keep working my way around, making the edges of the leaf like that's closest to the pumpkin, have that be the darker shade, and then the tips and the center a little bit lighter. Here I'm adding some veining, just playing around, and then softening it up with clear water wherever it looks like it needs to be softened, or where the veining was looking a little cartoonish, I just softened it up a bit. And just keep working my way around. Now we'll use some brown. So this is a thick consistency of the sepia. Then we'll just pull this color out with clear water. Get that little olive green, those little olive green leaves that are peeking out from under the cinnamon sticks and the pumpkin. And that leaf, I made it a little bit bigger. It looked like it was too small on the first layer. Now we can move on to our stem. So I'm using some of that olive green mixture that I mixed by using the sap green and the carbazole violet. Makes a nice deep olive green, those two colors. being sure to leave the highlight in the little center of my stem. And you want to, leave some highlights on the pumpkin as well. It's just those little thin strips of colors that you see. And now for these little leaves, I'm just adding a little bit more of the thicker consistency of the green and violet mix there. Making sure to let some of that first layer show through. And now I'm taking sepia right from the little paint can there. And we're just going to add in our shadows or at the base of the pumpkin and the base of the stem, and just darken up that little vine a little bit with the sepia. And as we add this thicker paint, you'll see it's starting to come into sharper and sharper focus as we work here. So I'm adding some of the sepia under the bottom of the pumpkin there, just to start building a little shadow under there, because there'd be a little shadow from where the leaves were sitting. Then we're going to work on the crumb of the donut. So this donut has a bite out of it. So I'm going to deepen up the color around the edges with sepia. And I work like right underneath the frosting there. Just add the color. And then we can pull it out with a clear brush. And then I noticed we needed to work on the leaf a little bit there. And now, since we have the sepia out, let's go back to the lid of the coffee mug. And I'm just going to start on our second layer on the coffee mug. So I'm just going to add some shadows like between the little layers or the ridges of the coffee mug here. And then we can even add some of that like right underneath the coffee cup holder, and then along the edges of the glass of the cup. And then I'll pull it out with some clear water. And then I thought we should add some more shadow here, since the bottom part of the mug is behind the cinnamon sticks and the pumpkin. So we'll get to that in a second. And I wanted the coffee mug to remain white for the most part, so I'm being careful not to add paint there. And then the little pumpkin will add some more detail here with some orange, and then we'll take some green for the stem. And then for the cinnamon sticks as well, we'll just add some, I think I reached for the sepia there, surprisingly enough. Yes. And then we'll add some sepia to the cinnamon sticks as well. I think I was struggling here just to figure out how to get the cinnamon sticks to come into focus. All right, so now we're going to add some veining on the leaves. So I'm taking a real small brush. This is a number 2. And with that sepia, I'm just adding some veining to the leaves there. Just touching up the little stem on the pumpkin on the mug. And just adding tiny, tiny little bits of veining on the different leaves with the sepia and a small brush. Now I mix the sepia with some of the red mixture we had for these red leaves here. And then we'll just add in the veining with that mixture. So this is a fun part where you just get to play with the colors on your palette. And these colors are pretty close to each other, so I don't think any of them will make mud. And even if they do, we've got a lot of brown in this painting, so that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. And then we're almost finished up here with our veining. So moving back to the crumb of the donuts again. Just dotting in some sepia there just to help build up the crumb. And now I thought we needed the frosting needed some texture, so I'm taking some of the sepia with a dry brush technique, just applying like little splotches of color there. Maybe they're little, maybe they're sprinkles, maybe it's some sprinkled gingerbread or cinnamon on them, but I just thought they needed a little bit of interest there. So that's why I'm adding that little detail. You can skip this step if you like, of course, but I just felt like I needed the little donuts to be a little sharper. So that's why I'm playing around there. For the ridges on the pumpkin, I just took some sepia and just went around the ridges on the pumpkin mug. And then this is really going to make the pumpkin pop, what we're doing here. So I'm taking sepia, real thick consistency right from the little paint can, and a small brush, and I'm just applying it right into the creases or right into the ridges of the little pumpkin. And I'm not pulling it out this time, just to help sharpen up those little ridges. And if you find that it looks too much drawn, you can always, go ahead and pull out the color. And then we'll add some shadows as well. So I'm taking the sepia, and then this is where we'll blend it out a little bit to just make it look like a little shadow. And then getting to work again on this little lid, just adding some more sepia to that. And the mug we're going to leave a little bit out of focus because it is towards the back of the scene, and I felt like the different images were fighting for one another a little bit. So I wanted to leave some parts of it a little bit less in focus. Now I'm just adding a tiny little shadow underneath the entire image. So I have my neutral tint, a real thin layer that I'm applying, and then I pull it out with clear water. And this is just to help ground it a little bit. It's just a really, really light shadow here. And then just add some little finishing touches here and there. So just making sure that the donuts are standing out from the pumpkin. I'll add some more little sprinkles or cinnamon dust, whatever you want to, whatever your favorite little donut topping is, you can add there. And again, just making sure that the donuts stand out from the images that they're resting against. Going back to the cinnamon sticks, this is again the most difficult part for me, just trying to get them to pop out of the scene just a little bit by adding some thin lines of sepia. We can fix up some of the veining here, and then we're going to add a shadow. So I have the neutral tint, and I'm just going to go underneath there and just add a little bit of a shadow. So it looks like the pumpkin is sitting on them and leaving a little bit of shadow there. Again, I'm just tinkering here, taking a look, and we are done. So that is our watercolor version of pumpkin spice coffee and donuts. You can purchase this image in my Etsy shop and then color along with me. I also have a version using Copic markers. So head over to that video. That's the video immediately before this one if you'd like to color in this image with Copic markers. And otherwise, have a great day, everyone. I will see you again soon in another video. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments and I will do my best to get back to you. Thanks.